In November 1989, the world watched, captivated, as the Berlin Wall came crashing down. Crowds surged, champagne flowed, and families separated for a generation wept with joy as they fell into each other's arms. The fall of the wall was a massive victory for freedom, a moment that seemed to close a dark chapter in human history. We all know the story of how the wall came down. But that's not the real story. The real story, the one that's far more troubling, is why a government would build a barrier of concrete and barbed wire that would eventually stretch 155 kilometers to cage its own people. Why it would create a death strip through the heart of a city, turning neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother. To understand that, we have to go backward. The story doesn't start with sledgehammers in 1989. It starts with a quiet, desperate exodus. Between 1949 and 1961, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, lost about 2.7 million people to the West. That's nearly a sixth of its entire population. Think about that. It's as if the entire modern-day city of Berlin just packed up and vanished over a decade. And these weren't just any people. This was a catastrophic brain drain. The ones leaving were the engineers, doctors, teachers, scientists, and skilled workers, the very people a nation needs to build a future. This was a hemorrhage that threatened the very existence of the East German state. To understand how a government became so terrified of its own citizens that its only solution was a wall, we have to rewind the clock to the ashes of World War II. In May 1945, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. Nazi Germany had unconditionally surrendered. But the peace that followed wasn't simple. The uneasy wartime alliance between the Western powers, the U.S., Great Britain, and France, and the Soviet Union, was already fracturing. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, the victorious Allies made a fateful decision. They would divide defeated Germany into 4 occupation zones. The British took the northwest, the French the southwest, and the Americans the southeast. The Soviet Union, whose Red Army had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front and captured Berlin, was given control of the entire eastern part of the country. But deep inside that Soviet zone, about 100 miles from the Western zones, was the capital, Berlin. Berlin was a special case. It, too, was carved into 4 sectors, mirroring the national division. The Soviets controlled East Berlin, while the Americans, British, and French controlled West Berlin. This created a strange and volatile situation, a small island of capitalism and democracy floating in a vast sea of communism. From day one, this arrangement was a flashpoint. The Allies had fundamentally different visions for Germany's future. The West wanted a rebuilt, democratic, and capitalist nation integrated into a free Europe. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had other plans. Fearing a resurgent Germany, Stalin sought to create a buffer of friendly, Soviet-controlled states in Eastern Europe. They stripped their zone of industrial assets as war reparations and started installing a government that would be loyal to Moscow. This ideological chasm had profound consequences for Germans. In the Western zones, life slowly began to normalize under a democratic framework, fueled by aid like the Marshall Plan. But in the Soviet zone, a different society was being forged, one based on communist principles, state control, and political loyalty to the Soviet Union. The four-power administration of Berlin, meant to be a symbol of cooperation, quickly became a microcosm of the brewing Cold War. The Allied Control Council, the body supposed to govern Germany, was paralyzed by disagreement. It became clear that the division of Germany wasn't just temporary. It was hardening into a border between 2 opposing worlds. And the city of Berlin, split down the middle, was sitting right on the fault line. By 1949, the pretense of a unified Germany was over. The growing chasm led to the formal creation of 2 separate German states. In May 1949, the 3 Western occupation zones merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, or West Germany. It was set up as a parliamentary democracy with a social market economy, its provisional capital in the quiet city of Bonn. West Germany aligned itself firmly with the West, embracing democratic freedoms, free enterprise, and individual liberties. Just a few months later, in October 1949, the Soviet Union responded by creating the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, from its occupation zone. East Berlin was declared its capital. Though its name had the word democratic, the GDR was a socialist state run by the Socialist Unity Party, SED, under the heavy influence of Moscow. It was a single-party dictatorship with a planned economy where the state controlled almost every aspect of life. The difference between these two new countries was night and day. West Germany, boosted by Western investment, launched its famous Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. Its cities were rebuilt, its industries boomed, and its citizens enjoyed a rising standard of living with access to consumer goods, freedom of speech, and the right to travel. Life in West Germany offered opportunity and freedom. Life in East Germany was very different. While the state provided guaranteed employment and state-funded childcare, it came at a high price. Freedoms were severely restricted. The press was controlled, political dissent was crushed, and the dreaded Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and surveillance, using a vast network of informants to monitor everyone. The planned economy struggled, leading to chronic shortages and a standard of living that fell far behind the West. For many East Germans, life felt drab, restrictive, and empty of the opportunities flourishing just across the border. And here's where Berlin's unique geography became so critical. While the border between East and West Germany was fortified as early as 1952, Berlin remained an anomaly. It was still technically a city under four-power occupation, and for years, you could move between the Soviet sector and the Western sectors with relative ease. You could just walk or take a subway from the communist East to the capitalist West. This open border was more than a curiosity. It was a loophole. It was a tear in the Iron Curtain, a portal between two opposing worlds. For millions of East Germans dreaming of a different life, West Berlin wasn't just another part of the city, it was an escape hatch. Before the wall was even a thought, the battle for Berlin had already been fought once, not with soldiers, but with airplanes. The Berlin blockade and airlift of 1948-49 was a defining moment of the early Cold War, a dress rehearsal for the conflict that would later give birth to the wall. By 1948, tensions were at a boiling point. The West was moving to create a unified West German state and had introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, to stabilize the economy. The Soviets saw this as a threat and a violation of past agreements. Their response was swift and brutal. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces blockaded West Berlin. They cut off all rail, road, and canal access from the western zones of Germany. The goal was ruthless: to starve the city into submission. The Soviets figured that by cutting off the 2 million residents of West Berlin from food, fuel, and supplies, they could force the Western Allies to abandon the city. It was a high-stakes gamble to drive the West out for good. The Western powers faced a terrible choice. They could try to break the blockade with military force, which would almost certainly mean war. They could abandon West Berlin, a massive political defeat. Or they could try the impossible. They chose the impossible. The United States and Great Britain launched Operation Vittles, better known as the Berlin Airlift. The plan was audacious: supply an entire city, from coal to flour, entirely by air. At first, even the Soviets thought it couldn't work, but they underestimated the resolve of the Western Allies. For nearly a year, a constant stream of American and British cargo planes flew into West Berlin's airports. At the height of the airlift, a plane was landing every 30 to 45 seconds. In total, they delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies. The sight of these Rosenbomber, or raisin bombers, as they were nicknamed by Berliners, became a symbol of hope. The airlift was a massive success. It kept West Berlin alive and served as a huge moral victory for the West. It showed the world their commitment to defending freedom. By May 1949, realizing the blockade had failed, the Soviets lifted it. The airlift had profound consequences. It solidified the division of the city and of Germany. It forged a powerful bond between West Berliners and the Western powers, turning the isolated half-city into a potent symbol of democratic resistance. This defiant, prosperous, and free city, sustained against all odds, now shone even more brightly as a beacon for those living under the tightening grip of communism just streets away. The airlift saved West Berlin, but in doing so, it magnified the very problem that would lead the East German government to its most desperate act. With two German states established and the victory of the airlift, West Berlin became more than a city sector. It became a promise. It was a brightly lit showcase of Western prosperity and freedom, right in the heart of East Germany. For a growing number of East Germans, this promise was irresistible. The open border in Berlin was their only way out, and they began to vote with their feet. The exodus grew from a trickle to a flood. Between 1949 and August 1961, around 2.7 million East Germans fled to the West. This mass migration, known as Republikflucht or Flight from the Republic, was a national emergency for the GDR. By 1961, the country had lost about a sixth of its population, and the numbers were accelerating. In the final months, up to 1,000 people were leaving every single day. What made this so catastrophic for the GDR was who was leaving. It was the young, the ambitious, and the highly educated. This was the brain drain in its most devastating form. The East German state had invested heavily in educating its citizens, only to watch them take their skills to the West. Engineers, technicians, doctors, lawyers, professors, and thousands of skilled workers packed their bags and left. The country was being hollowed out from the inside. People left for both political and economic reasons. Many were fleeing the oppressive political climate, the lack of free speech, and the constant surveillance by the Stasi. Others were drawn by the Wirtschaftswunder in West Germany, the higher salaries, better living standards, and abundance of consumer goods. A short subway ride could take you from a world of shortages and state control to a world of bustling shops and personal freedom. This hemorrhage of its best and brightest was a dual crisis for the East German leadership. Economically, it was crippling. The loss of skilled labor threatened to collapse the already struggling planned economy. How could you build a socialist paradise when all the builders were leaving? Ideologically, it was a profound humiliation. The communist state was supposed to be a workers' paradise, yet hundreds of thousands of workers were risking everything to flee to the capitalist West. It was a massive, undeniable vote of no confidence that undermined the legitimacy of the regime. The open border in Berlin was an open wound, and the leaders of the GDR knew they had to close it. The question was no longer if, but how. The brain drain crisis landed on the desks of two men. Walter Ulbricht, the hardline leader of East Germany, and Nikita Khrushchev, the volatile premier of the Soviet Union. Walter Ulbricht was a true believer in communism. He ruled East Germany with an iron fist, but he was presiding over a failing state. The mass exodus was a personal and ideological insult. For years, he had pleaded with Moscow for a solution, even blaming Soviet policies for East Germany's economic troubles. His preference was to absorb West Berlin entirely, but when that failed, he moved to his second option: seal the border, build a wall. Nikita Khrushchev, however, was hesitant. Building a physical barrier to imprison a population would be a monstrous propaganda defeat for communism. He worried it would escalate Cold War tensions. For a long time, he told Ulbricht to wait, hoping to solve the Berlin problem with threats and diplomacy. Ulbricht grew more desperate. In a now-famous press conference on June 15, 1961, a reporter asked him about closing the border. He responded with a blatant lie. Niemand hat die Absicht, ein Mauer zu errichten. No one has the intention of erecting a wall. It was the first time the word Mauer, or wall, was used in this context, and it was a total deception. Behind the scenes, the plans were already moving forward. What finally changed Khrushchev's mind was a mix of Ulbricht's relentless pressure and a new American president, John F. Kennedy. Khrushchev saw Kennedy as young and inexperienced, a view seemingly confirmed by the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. At a tense summit in Vienna in June 1961, Khrushchev bullied the young president and left believing that Kennedy, despite talking tough, wouldn't risk war over Berlin. As Kennedy himself would later admit, a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. With Khrushchev's perception of American weakness and Ulbricht's warnings that his country was about to collapse, the decision was made. In a secret meeting in Moscow on August 1, 1961, Khrushchev gave Ulbricht the green light. The plan, codenamed Operation Rose, was set in motion. The trap was about to be sprung. The end came with stunning speed. On Saturday, August 12, 1961, Walter Ulbricht hosted a garden party for GDR leaders, projecting an air of total normalcy while he signed the order to divide the city. The operation was to begin at midnight. As Berlin slept, Operation Rose launched under the cover of darkness. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, August 13th, thousands of East German soldiers and police moved into position. Street lights along the border were shut off. Trucks rumbled through the streets, loaded with concrete posts and rolls of barbed wire. Work began simultaneously across the entire 155-kilometer perimeter around West Berlin, including the 43-kilometer line that cut right through the city's heart. Soldiers tore up streets, dug holes, and uncoiled massive spools of barbed wire, creating a crude but effective barrier. In just a few hours, 193 streets and 68 of 81 crossing points were closed. The city's S-Bahn and U-Bahn train lines were severed. Berliners woke up that Sunday to a city turned into a prison. Familiar paths to work, school, or family were now blocked by armed guards. Families were torn apart in an instant. People visiting relatives in another sector found themselves trapped, unable to go home. The shock was palpable. Crowds gathered on both sides, staring at each other across the wire. On streets like the famous Bernauer Strasse, where apartments were in the east, but the sidewalk was in the west, the regime bricked up front doors and ground floor windows. For a short time, people made desperate escapes by jumping from upper-story windows into nets held by West Berlin firefighters, until those too were sealed. One of the most iconic images of those first days was of Konrad Schumann, a young East German border guard, leaping over a coil of barbed wire to freedom. His jump became a symbol of desperation, but for most, there was no escape. The trap had been sprung with chilling precision. The barbed wire was just the beginning. A more monstrous structure was on its way. The wall had begun. How do you justify building a wall to imprison your own people? A GDR leadership launched a massive propaganda campaign, giving their creation a cynical Orwellian name, the Antifaschistische Schutzwall, or the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart. According to the official narrative, the wall wasn't built to keep East Germans in. It was to keep Western fascists and spies out. Propaganda painted West Germany and its NATO allies as aggressors trying to sabotage the socialist state. They even claimed West Berliners were crossing over to buy up state-subsidized goods, hurting the economy. The wall, they argued, was a defensive shield. It was a lie that few people, even in the East, actually believed. The biggest clue to the wall's real purpose was which way the guns were pointing. The watchtowers, machine guns, and armed guards all faced inward toward East Berlin. The fortifications weren't designed to repel an invasion. They were designed to stop an escape. And while the border was sealed for East Germans trying to go west for most of the wall's life, West Berliners could still travel east. The reality of the wall was a horrifying contrast to the propaganda. The initial barbed wire was quickly replaced by concrete blocks. Over the next 3 decades, this evolved into a complex, multi-layered system of death. The death strip was a wide kill zone containing beds of nails, anti-vehicle trenches, and soft sand raked smooth to show footprints. It was lined with hundreds of watchtowers and illuminated by powerful searchlights. Most chillingly, border guards were ordered to shoot anyone attempting to cross. This wasn't a protective rampart. It was a cage. The name was a thin veil of propaganda hiding a brutal truth. The GDR government didn't trust its own people and was willing to use lethal force to control them. The story of the Berlin Wall is a powerful reminder of how far a government will go to maintain control, and the incredible risks people will take for freedom. It's a complex piece of history that still teaches us valuable lessons. If you're finding this deep dive valuable, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore the why behind major historical events every week, and your support helps us bring these critical stories to light. Now, let's get back to the human consequences of this concrete monster. The wall's construction had an immediate, devastating impact on the lives of ordinary Berliners. It was a concrete scalpel that sliced through the living tissue of a city. Neighborhoods were cleaved in two. Streets people had walked their entire lives now ended at a gray, concrete slab. The wall ran through buildings, across cemeteries, and along canals, a brutal scar on the landscape. The human cost was immeasurable. Families on opposite sides of the line on August 13, 1961, were suddenly separated with no clear way to see each other again. Parents were cut off from children, siblings from each other. For 28 years, they lived parallel lives, just miles apart, but separated by an impassable barrier. Communication was difficult and monitored, and visits were rare and restricted. The emotional toll of this forced separation left deep and lasting scars on generations of Germans. Life in the shadow of the wall, especially in East Berlin, was defined by confinement and fear. The wall was a constant physical reminder of the state's power and the lack of freedom. The ever-present Stasi cultivated an atmosphere of paranoia where you couldn't be sure who was an informant, destroying trust between neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. Ironically, building the wall to stop people from leaving actually intensified the pressure to flee. Before, leaving was an option. Now, staying meant accepting life in a prison. This new reality spurred incredible ingenuity as people sought ways to overcome the ever more lethal barrier. The wall itself became an evolving beast. What started as barbed wire and cinder blocks became, by the 1980s, the Grenzmauer 75, a sophisticated system made of 45,000 sections of reinforced concrete, each nearly 12 feet high and topped with a smooth pipe to make it impossible to grip. Behind it lay the death strip, a testament to the regime's grim determination. The wall was not just a structure. It was a system of control that stabilized the East German economy by force, but created a society built on repression and suffering. Despite the concrete, barbed wire, and shoot-to-kill orders, the wall could never extinguish the human desire for freedom. In the 28 years it stood, over 5,000 people successfully escaped to West Berlin. Their stories are a testament to breathtaking courage and ingenuity. Some escapes were acts of split-second daring. Early on, train engineer Harry Deterling hijacked a steam train with his family on board and smashed through the barriers into West Berlin. Another soldier, Wolfgang Engels, stole an armored personnel carrier and rammed it through the wall, escaping despite being shot twice. As the wall grew stronger, escape plans became more elaborate. Tunnels became a popular, though incredibly risky, method. One of the most successful was Tunnel 57, dug from a bakery cellar in the west, through which 57 people crawled to freedom in October 1964. The creativity was boundless. People escaped in secret car compartments. One man modified a tiny Austin Healey convertible, removing the windshield so he could drive right under the checkpoint barrier, smuggling his girlfriend and her mother out. Two families built a hot air balloon from bedsheets and sailed over the wall in 1979. Others ziplined across on a line shot over with a bow and arrow. But for every triumphant story, there was tragedy. The wall was deadly. At least 140 people are confirmed to have been killed trying to cross, though the true number may be higher. They were shot by border guards, drowned in canals, or died in accidents during their escape attempts. These victims became martyrs, their deaths highlighting the brutal inhumanity of the regime and transforming the wall from a political symbol into a gripping human drama. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall was the single most potent symbol of the Cold War. It was the physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain. To the West, it was a monument to communist failure. President John F. Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech in 1963 and President Ronald Reagan's challenge in 1987, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, cemented its status as a focal point of the global struggle. For East Germans, it was a daily reality of oppression. But by the late 1980s, the Eastern Bloc was crumbling. Reforms initiated by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev sent waves of change across Eastern Europe. Pro-democracy movements gained momentum in Poland and Hungary, which opened its border with Austria, creating a new hole in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans flooded into Hungary as a backdoor to the West. Back home, the pressure was building. Mass protests erupted in cities like Leipzig, with hundreds of thousands chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. The East German government was in crisis. In a desperate attempt to relieve the pressure, the Politburo decided to ease travel restrictions. This led to one of history's most famous blunders. On the evening of November 9, 1989, a mid-level official named Gunter Schabowski was tasked with announcing the new rules at a live press conference. Schabowski hadn't been fully briefed. When a reporter asked when the new rules would take effect, Schabowski, flustered, famously stammered, "As far as I know, that takes effect immediately, without delay." That was wrong. The rules were supposed to take effect the next day with a lengthy visa process. But the words were out. West German news reported that the wall was open. Within minutes, thousands of stunned East Berliners converged on the border crossings. The border guards, overwhelmed and without orders, faced a choice: open fire on their own people or open the gates. They opened the gates. The scenes that followed were pure joy. East and West Berliners poured through the checkpoints, embracing, crying, and celebrating. People climbed onto the wall at the Brandenburg Gate, dancing and hacking at the concrete with hammers. The symbol of division was being torn down by the very people it was built to contain. The story of the Berlin Wall, told in reverse, reveals a fundamental truth. It wasn't built from a position of strength, but out of profound weakness and desperation. It wasn't a rampart to protect a nation from its enemies. It was a cage built by a government that had become the enemy of its own people. The wall was the brutal endgame of an ideology that couldn't compete with the simple promise of freedom. It was a desperate attempt to stop a catastrophic brain drain that was bleeding the nation dry, a problem created by the very system the wall was meant to protect. The fall of the wall was a victory, but the reasons for its construction are a chilling warning. It reminds us what can happen when a state fears its citizens more than it serves them. It shows the extreme measures governments will take to cling to power when the reality of failure is all around them. the concrete slabs and barbed wire that scarred. Berlin for 28 years were the physical symptoms of a much deeper malady. A system that couldn't inspire loyalty, couldn't offer hope, and ultimately couldn't withstand the unyielding human desire to be free.